He stepped closer to me, his gaze unwavering, as though the entire world had faded away, leaving only the two of us. "Anna." His voice was deep, hoarse, and laden with an intense inner conflict that froze me in place. I stood motionless in the living room, every nerve in my body taut as though stretched to its limit. The oppressive silence was broken only by the heavy breathing that filled the space between us. The distance between us closed until I could feel the warmth of his breath brushing against my skin. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, each word slicing through the already suffocating tension. "Not for a single day, not for a single moment." I turned my face away, but his presence was overwhelming, impossible to ignore. "We can't do this, Liam," I whispered, my voice trembling, as though even I didn't believe the words I was saying. "We crossed that line a long time ago, and you know it," he replied, his tone steady but his steps bringing him closer. His hand lifted, grazing my shoulder with a touch so gentle yet so searing it sent heat coursing through me. I should have pushed him away. I should have run. But my feet felt anchored to the ground, refusing to obey. And then, without warning, his lips met mine. Soft but fervent, as though he were torn between holding on and letting go. My heart seemed to stop, only to ignite moments later, pulling me into a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't control. I knew this was wrong. I knew I shouldn't. But every ounce of logic dissolved, leaving me bare before the undeniable truth. I wanted this, even if only for a fleeting moment. The room seemed to vanish, leaving just the two of us and the dangerous intimacy of the kiss. But just as I felt myself sinking deeper, an abrupt sound broke through the haze. A sharp gust of wind slammed the back door against the frame. The noise jolted me back to reality like a cold slap across the face. I shoved Liam away, panic flooding my eyes. "No, we can't do this," I cried, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "This will ruin everything." Liam stared at me, his expression pained, as though he was searching for the right words to tear down the wall I'd erected between us, yet finding none. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. "But I can't change how I feel." I turned my back to him, tears spilling down my cheeks, shattering like glass as they fell. I heard his footsteps retreat, slow and heavy, each one carving deeper into my chest. The door closed behind him, and I was left standing there alone, enveloped by a silence that burned with bitterness. I knew in that moment that everything had changed. There was no going back, and I had no idea how to move forward. When the door closed behind Liam, I collapsed onto the couch, my hands cradling my face as the weight of everything crashed down around me. How had I let things come to this? I'd asked myself that question countless times, but the answer seemed buried deep in a maze of overlapping memories, fractured moments, and small decisions that had led me to this irreversible point. It didn't start today. It began long ago, the day I first met Liam, when David, my husband, introduced him to me. I remember the moment clearly. Liam, tall and lean, his tousled brown hair catching the sunlight, his piercing blue eyes tinged with a hint of shyness. David stood proudly beside him, one hand on his son's shoulder, his face glowing with fatherly pride. "Anna, this is Liam, my son," David said warmly, his voice filled with love. I smiled politely, hiding the awkwardness bubbling inside me. Becoming a stepmother had never been part of my life plan, and the fact that Liam was only 12 years younger than me blurred the boundaries of our relationship from the start. At that time, Liam had just returned home after a tough year living on his own. Nothing seemed to be going right for him. Unstable jobs, dwindling finances, and a strained relationship with his biological mother. David, ever the compassionate protector of his family, suggested that Liam move in with us at the ranch to start fresh. I agreed, thinking it was the best thing for him. Little did I know that decision would alter the course of my life forever. In the beginning, Liam and I were distant. He was reserved, offering only brief greetings and spending most of his time holed up in his room. I didn't blame him. I understood how uncomfortable it must be for a young man to have a stranger suddenly thrust into the role of stepmother. I didn't try to bridge the gap, thinking that time would naturally help us grow closer. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us only seemed to solidify. Everything shifted one sweltering summer day when David left for an extended work trip, leaving me and Liam alone at the ranch. I vividly remember the heat pressing down like a heavy blanket as I wrestled with a pile of dishes in the kitchen. Liam walked in, carrying an old wooden chair he'd found in the shed. "Do you want me to fix this?" he asked, his tone calm but tinged with hesitation. I looked up at him, surprised. He rarely initiated conversation. "This old thing?" I pointed to the chair. "It belonged to my mother. I didn't think it was salvageable." Liam shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I like a challenge," he replied. And with that, he set to work on the chair in the backyard, under the relentless summer sun. I watched him from the window, an inexplicable warmth blossoming inside me. For the first time, I saw Liam not as a lost young man, but as someone patient, thoughtful, and capable, a man I hadn't truly noticed before. From that day forward, we began to talk more. At first, our conversations were casual and mundane, revolving around chores or plans for the ranch. But gradually, they deepened. I found myself sharing dreams I'd long buried, of becoming an artist, dreams I'd abandoned for the sake of practicality. Liam, in turn, opened up about his struggles, the weight of expectations from David, the tense relationship with his mother, and the uncertainty of his path. We discovered a mutual understanding, a bond that grew stronger with every conversation. But that bond also brought emotions I wasn't prepared for. I started looking forward to the moments we talked, even if they were fleeting, whether in the kitchen or the backyard. I began noticing the way Liam moved, the way he smiled softly when I spoke, and the way his eyes lingered just a second too long when they met mine. What began as a faint flutter in my chest grew into a storm I couldn't contain. I tried to convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, that these feelings weren't real. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Every time David came home, I felt like I was hiding a monumental secret. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because my heart was quietly shifting towards someone I had no right to love. Now, as I sat there in the aftermath of what had just happened, I couldn't help but replay the past in my mind. What had led me here? Was it the loneliness, the emotional disconnect with David? Or was it something buried within me that I had been avoiding for too long? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. What happened with Liam wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of cracks in my life that I had ignored for far too long. And now I was left to face the consequences of a reality I never anticipated. The following days at the ranch were a blur of emotions, confusion, guilt, longing, all tangled into a web that I couldn't unravel. I tried to push through, to act as though nothing had happened. I busied myself with chores, staying out of Liam's way, avoiding the places I knew he'd be. But his presence lingered, not just in the ranch but in my mind. I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened, nor the lingering sense that it had somehow been inevitable. Liam, for his part, avoided me too. He was distant, polite but cold, retreating into himself in a way that made the silence between us unbearable. He didn't meet my gaze, didn't linger in rooms where I was. And yet, the memory of his touch, his words, the look in his eyes, none of it faded. If anything, it grew stronger, gnawing at my resolve, making me question every decision I'd ever made. One evening, when the summer heat gave way to a cooler breeze, I found myself in the garden pruning the overgrown rose bushes. It was a simple task, one I usually enjoyed, but tonight my thoughts were too loud. I didn't hear Liam approach until he was right behind me. "Anna," he said softly, his voice startling me out of my reverie. I turned to face him, and for a moment we just stood there, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "What is it, Liam?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I wanted to apologize for what happened. It wasn't right and it's my fault. I shouldn't have. He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the ground. It wasn't just your fault, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We both let it happen. But it can't happen again. You know that, right? He nodded, but his expression was tortured. I know. But that doesn't change how I feel. I froze. His words hung in the air, wrapping around me like a vice. Liam, don't, I started, but he cut me off. I need to say it, Anna. I need you to know. He stopped himself, shaking his head. I care about you, more than I should, more than is right, and I hate myself for it. Liam, please, I begged, my voice trembling. You can't. We can't. I know, he said, his voice breaking, but I can't just turn it off. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You have to try, Liam. We both do. This can't destroy everything. He nodded again, his jaw clenched tight. I'll stay out of your way. I'll make it easier for you. I promise. Thank you, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I watched him turn and walk away, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. I wanted to call out to him, to stop him, but I stayed rooted in place, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look, every touch. I knew Liam was right to distance himself, and I knew I had to do the same. But the thought of losing him, of erasing whatever it was we had shared, was unbearable. I had never felt so seen, so understood, and the loss of that connection felt like losing a part of myself. Over the next few days, Liam kept his promise. He avoided me completely, leaving the room whenever I entered, staying out late to work on the fences or repairs around the property. David returned from his trip, cheerful and unaware of the storm raging beneath the surface. He kissed my cheek, told me how much he had missed me, and I smiled and pretended everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. The distance between me and Liam didn't make things easier. It made them harder. The space between us was filled with tension, with longing, with 1,000 words left unsaid. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a life I didn't know how to fix. One afternoon when David was out running errands, I found Liam in the barn, repairing a broken stall door. I hesitated at the entrance, watching him work. He looked tired, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment I considered leaving, but something kept me rooted in place. Liam, I said softly, stepping inside. He looked up, startled, and then quickly averted his eyes. Anna, he said, his voice tight. What are you doing here? I needed to talk to you, I said, my voice shaking. I can't keep pretending like nothing's wrong. He sighed, setting down his tools. There's nothing to talk about. We both know what we have to do. But that doesn't make it any easier, I said, taking a step closer. Liam, I don't want to lose you. You're not losing me, he said, though his voice cracked. I'm right here. I can't be what you need me to be. Tears streamed down my face as I closed the distance between us. I don't know what I need anymore, I admitted. But I know this thing between us. It's real. Real doesn't mean it's right, he said, his voice filled with anguish. You have David. You have a life. I can't take that away from you. You're not taking anything, I said. I'm the one who... I stopped, choking on my words. I'm the one who let this happen. He reached out, his hand brushing my cheek, and I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch. I care about you, Anna. I always will. But we can't do this. You know that. I know, I whispered, my voice breaking. But it doesn't make it hurt any less. For a moment we stood there, the weight of our emotions pressing down on us. Then Liam stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice firm. "It's the only way." "No," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "For both our sakes." I didn't stop him. I couldn't. I watched as he gathered his things, as he walked out of the barn and into the fading sunlight. I stood there long after he was gone, the silence around me deafening. That night, I told David everything was fine. I smiled, kissed him, and pretended our life was perfect. But deep down, I knew I'd lost something I could never get back. And yet I also knew it was the only way forward, for both of us, for all of us. The days following that fateful evening were a storm of tension, regret, and emotions I couldn't fully comprehend. Everything between Liam and me had shifted irreversibly. An invisible wall of awkwardness and unspoken feelings had settled between us, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. Our once casual conversations had dwindled into fleeting glances and deliberate silence, each of us avoiding the other, as if that alone could undo what had already been done. I tried to immerse myself in the rhythms of daily life, clinging to chores and routines like lifelines. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, as though he saw through every mask I wore. It was an intensity I had never felt before, not even with David. Every time I heard Liam's footsteps in the hallway or caught sight of him working outside through the window, my chest tightened with a mixture of longing and guilt. Liam had changed too. He was no longer the relaxed, approachable figure who had casually fixed broken furniture or exchanged light-hearted banter. He kept his distance, his demeanour guarded, his presence shadowed by a palpable discomfort. Still, I could feel his gaze linger on me from across the room or the yard, fleeting but charged, as though he couldn't help himself, even though he knew he should. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table with David, the tension was unbearable. David, oblivious to the undercurrents between us, chatted away cheerfully about his work and upcoming projects. I nodded along, trying to match his enthusiasm, but my mind was elsewhere. Liam remained mostly silent, picking at his food and barely looking up. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on, and I felt like any misstep would shatter the fragile facade we were clinging to. After dinner, David retreated upstairs to work in his study, leaving me to clean up in the kitchen. I welcomed the solitude but wasn't alone for long. Liam lingered near the doorway, his presence a quiet storm behind me. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until I couldn't bear it anymore. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound composed. "We need to talk." For a moment, he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raw. "I don't think there's anything to say." I turned to face him, and our eyes met. In his gaze I saw everything, his pain, his regret, and the feelings he could no longer suppress. "Liam, we can't go on like this. We need to figure this out." He let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and unexpected. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't wake up every day hating myself for what I've done? For what we've done?" His words hit me like a physical blow and I flinched, tears stinging my eyes. "I never meant to hurt you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he said, his tone softening but still laced with anguish. "And I've been trying to stay away. But you're here, Anna. You're always here and I—" He stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I can't stop thinking about you." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I searched for the right words. "Liam, I'm sorry. I don't know how to make this right." He took a step closer, and suddenly the space between us seemed unbearably small. "You're not the only one who doesn't know," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. For a heartbeat we stood there, caught in a moment that felt like it could stretch forever. I knew I should step back, draw a line, but I couldn't move. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming. But then, the sound of David's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Liam immediately stepped back and I turned away, busying myself with the dishes as though nothing had happened. When David entered, blissfully unaware, I exhaled a shaky breath of relief. But deep down, I knew that moment had changed everything. The days that followed were even more excruciating. Liam and I avoided each other entirely, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house. But the distance didn't make things easier. It made them worse. The unspoken words, the unresolved emotions, they festered in the silence, growing heavier with each passing day. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me with such raw vulnerability. And I hated myself for it, for the pain I was causing him and for the feelings I couldn't seem to suppress. One afternoon, while David was out meeting with a client, I sat alone in the living room, trying and failing to focus on a book. The quiet of the house was oppressive, and when I heard Liam's footsteps approach, my heart sank. He stopped at the doorway, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, setting the book aside as he sat across from me. His hands were clasped tightly, his knuckles white, as though he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. "I'm leaving," he said, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No, Liam, you don't have to—" I started, but he cut me off. "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "I can't stay here, Anna. Not like this. Every day I'm here, I feel like I'm ruining everything, your life, David's life, and my own." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't try to stop them. "Liam, please," I whispered. "We can figure this out. You don't have to go." He shook his head, his expression resolute. "I can't, and you know it. This isn't fair to anyone." I didn't have an argument. I knew he was right, but the thought of losing him was unbearable. "Liam, I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't," he said, his voice softening. "Not intentionally. And you're the most amazing person I've ever known, Anna. But staying here will only make things worse." I watched as he stood, his movements deliberate, as though he was trying to hold himself together. "Thank you," he said quietly. And then he was gone. I sat there long after he left, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight. The pain was suffocating, but I knew he was right. This was the only way to salvage what was left of our lives. It was the only way to move forward, even if it felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. After Liam said he would leave, I sat quietly in the living room, feeling as though everything in my life was being swept into a storm. Silence filled the house, but inside me, a whirlwind of emotions raged. Love, guilt, and loss, all interwoven and crushing my heart. I knew Liam was right, that his leaving was the only way to keep everything from collapsing. Yet the thought of never seeing him again felt like losing a vital part of my life. That evening, when David returned home, I tried to greet him with a smile, as I always did. He stepped into the house, placed his coat on the rack and his briefcase on the table, still the devoted and loving man I had vowed to protect at all costs. He looked at me with the kind of trust that I knew I no longer deserved. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess my mistakes. But I couldn't. Not because I feared his judgment, but because I couldn't bear to destroy the life we had built together. "Is everything okay, Anna?" David asked gently, his voice full of concern. I nodded, trying to hide the turmoil within me. "Yes, everything's fine. How was work? Were you tired today?" He smiled and sat down next to me. "Not too bad, but I missed you. Lately I feel like you've been a little distant. Is there something going on?" His question made me pause. I wanted to say no, to assure him that everything was okay, but his voice was so sincere, so full of love that I couldn't lie. I reached for his hand, feeling the warmth and steadiness he brought into my life. "David, I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry for not giving you the time and attention you deserve. I promise I'll change. I'll do better." He squeezed my hand, his eyes soft and reassuring. We all go through difficult times, Anna. What matters is that we have each other. His words were like a dagger to my heart. I didn't deserve his love, but I knew I had to protect it. I had to do everything to make up for my mistakes and ensure I would never repeat them. The next day, Liam packed his belongings and prepared to leave. I stood by the window watching as he loaded his suitcase into the car, feeling as though everything inside me was shattering. I wanted to step outside, to say goodbye, but I knew it would only make things harder. Instead, I stood silently, letting tears stream down my face. When Liam was about to get into his car, he paused and looked up at the window where I stood. Our eyes met, and in that moment, every emotion we had shared was laid bare. I said nothing, only gave him a small nod, a final goodbye, an acknowledgement that this was the only way to end things. Liam smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression filled with both sadness and relief. He got into the car and drove away, leaving me standing there feeling as though a piece of me had left with him. But I knew this was the right thing to do. It was the only way for both of us to move forward. As time passed, I focused on my life with David. We spent more time together, taking walks, enjoying dinners, and sharing stories we had neglected before. I learned to love him again, not with the passionate excitement of our early days, but with a deep sense of appreciation and commitment that could only come from years of shared life. Yet no matter how much I tried, memories of Liam didn't entirely fade. Sometimes as I stood in the kitchen, I'd think of his gaze, his smile, and the way he made me feel like a woman truly seen. But I also knew that those memories were just a fragment of my story, a piece that I couldn't allow to define me. I never saw Liam again, but I hoped he found the peace and happiness he deserved. As for me, I chose to stay, to protect what I had built with David, and to forgive myself. Because in the end, life isn't defined by moments of weakness. It's defined by the choices we make, no matter how difficult. And I knew, with every fibre of my being, that I had made the right choice.